Most people do not break in the moment of crisis. They break long before it arrives. They break in the thousand silent negotiations they make with discomfort, in the habits of avoidance that teach the mind to flee, in the private surrender no one else can see. And when hardship finally comes, it does not destroy them by force. It simply reveals what was already collapsing within. In old Japan, there was a word for the strength that refuses this quiet collapse. That word was Gaman. Gaman is often translated as endurance, but that translation is too small. It is not merely the act of surviving pain, it is the discipline of bearing what is difficult with dignity, order, and restraint. It is the refusal to let suffering make you ugly. In the spirit of Bushido, the way of the warrior, Gaman was not weakness disguised as patience. It was power held under command. Gaman. Miyamoto Musashi understood this well. He wrote not about comfort, but about readiness. Not about emotional display, but about steadiness under pressure. The swordsman who panics at confusion is already defeated before steel leaves the scabbard. The mind that needs life to be smooth, fair, and gentle becomes the servant of circumstance. But the mind trained to endure becomes something else entirely. It becomes unshakable. There is a man named Ren who did not know this. He was not a warrior, not a monk, not a master of any ancient art. He was an ordinary man with an ordinary face, who woke each morning with a heaviness he could not explain. His days were filled with silent irritations, unfinished tasks, hidden disappointments, and the exhausting performance of appearing fine. He was not collapsing dramatically. He was eroding quietly, which is often worse. Each day began with resistance. He delayed getting out of bed, delayed answering messages, delayed facing the simplest obligations. His room was not chaos, but it was neglected. His thoughts were not madness, but they were disorderly. He felt as if life had become a constant, low-pressure storm, one he was always walking through without shelter. And because his suffering did not look impressive from the outside, he believed he had no right to call it suffering at all. That belief made him weaker. A man who is ashamed of his pain cannot examine it clearly. A man who cannot examine it clearly becomes its hostage. So Ren did what many do. He sought relief in distraction, more noise, more escape, more small indulgences that promised rest and delivered only dullness. He did not know it yet, but he was practicing the opposite of Gaman. He was rehearsing surrender. Chapter 1. The Weight That Cannot Be Seen. One evening, after another day that felt strangely exhausting despite having accomplished almost nothing, Ren visited his grandfather. The old man had once studied Japanese history with unusual devotion. His shelves were lined with worn books on Zen, sword schools, and the codes of old samurai houses. He was not sentimental about the past. He respected it because it understood something the modern world often forgets: that endurance is not an emergency skill. It is a daily discipline. Ren spoke for a long time, though what he said could have been reduced to a single confession. He was tired of feeling weak, tired of being ruled by moods, tired of needing the world to cooperate before he could act with clarity. His grandfather listened without interruption, then reached for a small notebook and wrote one word in careful ink: Gaman. He slid the notebook across the table and said nothing more for a while. Then he explained that in difficult times, Japanese families would speak of Gaman not as heroism, but as proper conduct, to endure the unbearable without complaint, not because pain should be denied, but because one's character must not be surrendered to it. This was not the coldness of a stone. It was the composure of a disciplined heart. Ren frowned. It sounded beautiful, but also severe. He asked what good endurance was if it changed nothing. His grandfather answered with the kind of truth
that does not flatter. Endurance does not always change the world around you. It changes the one place from which all your actions emerge. If that place remains disordered, then even good fortune will be wasted. But if that place becomes steady, even hardship can be used. That night, Ren went home unsettled. He had expected comfort and received a burden. Yet beneath the burden was a strange relief. For the first time, he saw that his problem was not simply stress, fatigue, or bad luck. His problem was that he had trained himself to retreat from friction. Every small discomfort had become a command, and every time he obeyed it, he carved weakness deeper into his nature.
Chapter 2: The Samurai and the Closed Mouth. In the old warrior traditions, silence had value for a reason, not because speech is evil, but because complaint disperses energy. It takes suffering and spreads it everywhere, making it larger than it was. Bushido taught restraint not as repression, but as sovereignty. To master the face, the tongue, and the posture was to prevent inner disorder from governing outer action. A warrior was expected to remain composed, not for appearance alone, but so the mind could continue to see clearly. Musashi warned against agitation. He understood that fear, anger, and confusion narrow perception. They make a man impulsive, and impulse is easy to defeat. The greatest danger in adversity is not the adversity itself. It is the loss of form within it. Once a man becomes formless, he cannot direct himself. He becomes reactive, which means he belongs to whatever disturbs him most. Ren began to understand that he had been speaking too much to himself in the language of weakness. He narrated his own fatigue. He repeated his own resentment. He explained his own delays with elaborate sympathy. None of this made him stronger. It made his suffering more familiar. And what becomes familiar begins to feel like identity. This is how many men become loyal to their own limitations without ever noticing. So he made a quiet vow. For 7 days, he would stop negotiating with every feeling. He would rise at the first alarm. He would put his room in order before leaving it. He would complete one difficult task before seeking comfort. And he would not announce any of this to anyone. These actions were small enough to seem almost childish, but that was precisely the point. Gaman does not begin with dramatic sacrifice. It begins with the refusal to flee small hardship. The first morning was ugly. His body resisted. His mind instantly produced arguments that seemed reasonable and compassionate. Sleep more. Start tomorrow. You are already tired. None of these voices were new. What was new was that he observed them without obedience. He stood up anyway. And in that small act, nothing outside changed, but something inside shifted. For one brief moment, he was no longer being dragged through the day. He was walking into it. Chapter 3: Endurance without drama. Many people misunderstand discipline because they imagine it must feel powerful. They expect a clean surge of resolve, a bright and heroic certainty. But real discipline often feels plain. Sometimes it feels almost disappointing. It is not a storm, it is a steady hand. Zen teaches something similar in its devotion to ordinary acts performed with complete attention. Wash the bowl, sweep the floor, sit upright, return to the breath. Great strength often enters through very narrow doors. Ren's new life did not look impressive from the outside. He woke early. He folded his blanket. He stood under cold water for a few breaths before turning it warm. He sat for 10 minutes in silence each morning, not searching for peace, but learning not to panic in stillness. He wrote down the single task he would complete that day, even if everything else went poorly. Then he completed it before noon. This was his training in Gaman, not enduring catastrophe, but enduring himself, enduring boredom without escape,
enduring uncertainty without immediate reassurance, enduring fatigue without theatrics, enduring the ache of unfinished grief that sometimes rose in him when the room grew quiet. He began to see that his deepest weakness had not been pain. It had been the constant desire to be rescued from pain. There is a severe kindness in this realization. Once you understand that not every discomfort is an enemy, your life becomes simpler. You stop building your days around avoidance. You stop asking every hour to be pleasant. You stop treating inconvenience as injustice. And then, slowly, the mind recovers its shape. It becomes less needy, less noisy, less fragile. Musashi spoke of perceiving what cannot be seen. This is one of the hidden things he meant. The unseen battle is often not between you and the world. It is between you and your demand that the world stop pressing against you. A sword is forged by heat and repeated striking. Character is not formed differently. It too is shaped by pressure, repetition, and the willingness to remain intact under both.
Chapter 4: The Fire Beneath the Surface. Weeks passed, and Ren became more reliable, not transformed in the dramatic sense, but less scattered, less delayed, less dependent on mood. Yet improvement carries its own danger. When life begins to feel manageable, old habits do not disappear. They wait. The test of Gaman is not only whether you can endure when motivated, it is whether you can endure when discouraged, unseen, and disappointed. That test came quietly. A position Ren had hoped for slipped away after months of effort. The news arrived in a brief message, polite and final. He read it twice, then sat motionless at his desk. The old impulse returned at once. Withdraw. Delay everything. Seek numbing. Build a shrine to your own discouragement and kneel before it. The mind is ancient in its habits. It can run back to weakness with astonishing speed. For an hour, he did nothing. Then he remembered something his grandfather had said. The true measure of endurance is not whether pain visits you, but whether pain is allowed to command your conduct. So Ren stood, put on his shoes, and went for a walk without music, without his phone, without any companion except the blow to his pride. He did not pretend he felt strong. He simply refused to become shapeless. This is the core of Gaman. Not denial, not performance, not the rigid fantasy of becoming invulnerable. It is the act of containing suffering so that it does not spread through every corner of your life. It is saying, this pain may sit with me, but it may not drive me. It is the quiet decision to keep form when the heart wants collapse. By evening, the disappointment remained, but it had changed character. It was no longer a master. It was only a burden. And burdens, unlike masters, can be carried. This is what many fail to learn. Suffering becomes unbearable, not only because it is heavy, but because we kneel beneath it too quickly. The warrior spirit does not always remove the weight. Sometimes it simply stands. Chapter 5: The Elimination of Excess. As Ren's understanding deepened, he noticed that endurance is weakened by excess. Too much noise, too many choices, too many promises, too many comforts used carelessly. The samurai life, at its best, was not luxurious, it was ordered. A man who needs many things to remain stable has made himself vulnerable in many directions. Simplicity is not aesthetic purity, it is strategic strength. So he began to remove what made him soft. He stopped ending each day in mindless distraction. He ate more plainly. He reduced the clutter in his room until every object either served a purpose or carried quiet meaning. He stopped speaking casually about plans he had not yet earned. He guarded his energy, not by becoming cold, but by becoming deliberate. Each small removal returned some piece of his attention. Zen has always understood that emptiness is not absence. It is space that allows right action. A crowded mind
cannot observe itself. A crowded life cannot hear truth. Gaman requires room because endurance is easily drowned by stimulation. If every discomfort can be instantly covered with entertainment, food, chatter, or complaint, then the soul never develops the muscles needed to remain upright in silence. Musashi wandered much of his life with very little. This was not an accident. A man carrying less can move more freely. A mind attached to less can see more clearly. Ren saw that his old exhaustion had not come only from hardship. It had come from the friction of a life padded with unnecessary habits. He had not merely been tired, he had been diluted. This is why small, non-negotiable actions matter more than grand declarations. One clear morning routine, one honest hour of focused work, one walk taken without distraction, one moment of restraint when anger wants to speak. These are not trivial. They are repetitions of identity. A man becomes what he consistently confirms. If he repeatedly confirms steadiness, then steadiness becomes available to him when it is most needed.
Chapter 6: The Face of Quiet Strength. Months later, Ren returned to his grandfather's house. There was no triumphant music in his life, no sudden perfection, no magical immunity from fear or sadness. But there was something visible now that had not been there before. His movements were less rushed. His words were more economical. His eyes did not wander as much. He had become quieter, and unlike before, that quiet no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited. His grandfather noticed at once. They shared tea in long stretches of silence that no longer made Ren uneasy. Finally, the old man asked what had changed. Ren answered carefully. He said that at first he thought endurance meant tolerating life. Now he understood it meant shaping himself so that life's difficulty did not scatter him. He had not become free from pain. He had become less available to disorder. The old man nodded. Then he spoke of an old principle, found not only in warrior ethics, but in many deep traditions of Japan. Dignity is preserved in conduct long before it is tested in disaster. A person does not rise to noble behavior by accident. He practices it in private, in small rooms, on ordinary mornings, when no witness is present. By the time the hard season arrives, the pattern has already been laid. This is where many search in the wrong direction. They wait for inspiration instead of building form. They search for a feeling that permits action, when action itself is what refines feeling. They ask how to become strong without first asking what they repeatedly obey. But Gaman begins with obedience to what is right, not what is easy. And that obedience, repeated with calm consistency, slowly frees a person from the tyranny of impulse. Ren understood now why the ancient teachings seem severe. They are severe because life is not gentle enough to be met with softness alone. There must be some iron within the spirit, some stable center that does not bargain with every passing weather. Yet this iron is not cruelty. It is not hardness toward others. Properly understood, it is the strength that prevents one's pain from becoming everyone else's burden.
Chapter 7: To Endure Without Breaking. There will be seasons in every life when nothing can be fixed quickly. Loss will not be reversed. Uncertainty will not clarify on demand. Fatigue will not vanish because you have suffered enough. In such seasons, many people become frantic because they have built their peace on conditions. When the conditions fail, they fail with them. But the old Japanese wisdom points in another direction. Build your center where conditions cannot rule. Gaman is how this begins. Bear the difficult day without turning bitter. Hold your posture when the mind wants to slump into self-pity. Complete the necessary task even when the heart is restless. Let pain visit, but do not offer it authority. Return to silence. Return to order. Return to the smallest right action available to you, and protect that action as if your life depends on it. Often, it does. Gaman. This is not a teaching for warriors alone. It is for the parent who must remain gentle while carrying private grief. It is for the man who must rebuild after failure without making a theater of despair. It is for the woman who continues her duties with grace while life presses heavily against her ribs. It is for anyone who has learned that real strength is rarely loud. More often, it is nearly invisible. Miyamoto Musashi sought victory, but not only over opponents. The deeper victory was over confusion, hesitation, attachment, vanity, and fear. Bushido demanded honor, but honor was never merely public. It lived in self-command. Zen pointed toward emptiness, but not as escape. It pointed toward a mind uncluttered enough to meet reality directly, and Gaman is what joins them in practice. Endure, remain composed, continue. So when hardship comes, do not ask first how to escape it. Ask how to meet it without surrendering your shape. Ask what must be removed from your life so your spirit becomes less dependent on comfort. Ask which small disciplines, if repeated daily, would make you trustworthy in moments of strain. Then begin there, quietly, without drama. Fold the blanket, clean the room, keep the promise, sit in silence, finish the task. In time, you may discover that breaking is not always a sudden event. It is often the long habit of abandoning yourself in small ways, and if that is true, then strength is also not sudden. It is the long habit of remaining present, remaining ordered, remaining faithful to what is necessary, remaining upright under weight. This is the path of Gaman. To endure without breaking is not to feel nothing. It is to carry what must be carried without allowing it to deform your soul. It is to suffer when suffering is required, with discipline instead of collapse. It is to become the kind of person whose silence is not emptiness, but control. And in a world that teaches constant reaction, that kind of stillness is not weakness. It is mastery.